A value for money Sony TV sounds like a myth, right? Well, not anymore. Right behind me is the Sony Bravia 5 mini LED TV, and this is a 65-inch version of that TV. Now, after discounts, this TV in this specific size is available for approximately 1.35 lakhs, and it feels like the most sensible Sony TV that you can buy in India today. I know that 1.35 lakhs is still a lot of money, but in general, if you've taken a look at Sony TV prices, you know that they're the most expensive options in the market, but that's not true for the Bravia 5. Having said that, if you're rushing to buy the TV right away, I'd say stop, because there is a big but in that statement. I'll tell you all about the TV and the big but, that's what she said, in this detailed review of the Sony Bravia 5. Alright, if you're watching me for the first time, I'm Ashad. This is Trakin Tech English, your destination for detailed, incisive gadget reviews. Now, design-wise, if you look at the Bravia 5, it's clean, it's minimal, it's got that modern look, but more importantly, the bezels are really slim as well, so you get like a very good screen estate, and the bezels are never a problem when you're watching TV. But one interesting thing that I noted is when the TV came in, it came without a stand or a wall mount. Apparently, that's a new Sony strategy for all the TVs that they sell in India. So when they get to the installation part, that's when the engineer asks you whether you want to table mount it or wall mount it. And Sony does this to save on packaging costs, which is good for Sony, but good for the environment as well, because smaller packages. Now, I generally prefer table mounting our TVs, and the one good thing about the 65-inch variant that I noticed is that the feet are actually at the center and not spread wide apart. They're about 19 inches away from each other, and even if you have a small table, they can perch on top of it very easily. But the problem with the two center stands is that if the weight distribution hasn't been handled properly, it could wobble a lot, but that's not true for the Bravia 5. I'd say it's pretty rock solid for even a large TV. Now, guys, if you like my reviews and if you want my career to be rock solid and not wobbly like the Sony Bravia 5, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Now let's talk about the ports. They're tucked away neatly at the rear, and even if you wall mount it, there's enough space for you to actually reach it. That's very well engineered if you ask me. Now, talking about the ports, you get 4 HDMI ports at the rear, of which 2 are HDMI 2.1 ports, which means that you get 4K 120Hz out of that 2 ports, along with one of them having eARC support as well. Apart from that, you get 2 USB ports, optical out, AV in, Ethernet, headphone jack. All of the essentials that you need are here. Although I wish that all the 4 ports on this TV were HDMI 2.1 compliant, because a competitor like the Samsung QN90F actually gives you that option. But that's not it, because with the Samsung QN90F, you also do get one port that does up to 4K 165Hz as well. Now, if you're a PC gamer and if you want to connect your PC to the TV, then this 4K 165Hz option comes in handy. I know it's a niche, but still, it's a good option to have, right? Alright, now let's talk about this remote design. It's very standard, but it's kind of nice. And I say nice because you get options for all of the controls that you need, including hotkeys for Sony Picture Score, Netflix, YouTube, Prime Video, Crunchyroll, and of course, Sony Live as well. Now, I had a couple of problems with the remote that I wanted to highlight. The first thing is that you do not get a backlight on the keys, which is a problem because most of us watch TV in the dark and then you end up fumbling for the buttons. Also, talking about buttons, there are way too many buttons to invoke the settings. There's a menu button, there's separate settings like, gear, and 3 of them in total, basically. Now, that's about the remote, but as you might have noticed already, this TV actually runs Google TV, and it runs very fast. I have no complaint. There's not much to talk about it either. It's pretty responsive and fluid. As responsive and fluid as a Google TV can get. But I was surprised to note that quite a few apps do come pre-installed with the TV itself. Thankfully, you can uninstall all of them. For example, like I said, Crunchyroll is pre-installed, which is something I didn't expect. And apart from that, there's Sony Select, Living Decor, Calvin Bavia, and a couple of others. But most of them are useful, so if you want, you can actually keep them. And the good thing is that they do not take up a lot of the internal storage. Even after installing a couple of my own apps, I still had about 14 GB left in the 16 GB internal storage. Alright, now let's talk about the picture quality, and that's the reason why most people actually look at a Sony TV, right? Now, this is a 4K 120Hz mini LED panel with HDR support, of course, so you get standards like Dolby Vision, HDR10, and HLG support out of the box, but there's no support for HDR10+. Now, Sony doesn't disclose any specific metrics like the dimming zones or even the brightness numbers, but we checked out AV forums and they mentioned that it has 384 local dimming zones. Now, when it comes to TVs in the hierarchy of display technology, of course, OLED comes at the top, then you have mini LED, then you have QLED, and then you have your regular LED TVs. So the mini LED TVs, of course, come with great black levels, which are better than QLED TVs, and for someone like me who uses the OnePlus TV Q1 Pro every day, this was quite a step up. And the black levels are pretty deep. The contrast ratio is also very, very good. But there's one fundamental problem with mini LED that a lot of people do note, is the fact that there is blooming around bright objects once in a while. But in my testing, the blooming has been handled really well, so much so that there is negligible blooming around bright objects, and I did play a bunch of videos to test it out. For example, the HDR bloom test, it was fine. The Apple TV splash logo whenever you start a new Apple TV show has some bloom on certain mini LED TVs. That's not a problem here. It even handled the Death Stranding 2 intro screen absolutely fine. Now, talking about viewing angles, some reviewers complained about the fact that the viewing angles are not that great and the color shifts at extreme angles, but I didn't notice that at all. In fact, I felt like the viewing angles were pretty good. Having said that, the brightness levels are not the TV's strong suit, I must say that. Like I said, Sony doesn't divulge any numbers, but what we figured out is that you can get about around 1000 nits when you're watching HDR content in like a very small 10% window. Now, it can also go up to 800 nits when you're watching HDR content. Now, these are numbers, but if you have to have some context, if you pit it against a competition like the QN90F, that Samsung TV can get much brighter than the Sony one. And that's not it. That Samsung TV also has an anti-glare coating on top of its display. So if I have to sum it up for you, if you're watching the Sony Bravia 5 in a completely dark environment, then the brightness should not be a problem. In fact, the TV will be plenty bright for you. But if you have a very bright room or if you have sunlight falling on your TV, then it's better to go for the Samsung model. Now, color tuning in HDR is good, but in HDR content, it's a little off. But Sony does give you a lot of options to tune the color according to what you prefer. And in general, when you look at it, the picture modes, I would suggest that if you're watching HDR content, then use the cinema mode. It's the closest to what, the artist intended. So the color tuning is fine there. And if you're watching Dolby Vision content, anyway, the color is controlled by the Dolby Vision tuning itself. However, one area where Sony outclasses the competition is when you have any upscaling to contend with. Say, for example, if you're watching 720p or 1080p content on this 4K display, the upscaling engine with the intelligent XR that Sony has is so good that it does a fairly good job of ensuring that if you're at a distance, you won't feel the loss of detail. And like I said, there are so many different settings that you can tinker around with. It's a tinkerer's paradise, if you ask me. For example, just head into the brightness setting and you will notice that, of course, you can change the local dimming levels, which a lot of TVs provide. But you also have the option to adjust the HDR gradation to what you like. You can change the peak luminance levels, you have advanced contrast tuning, and you can also adjust the black levels to your liking. Honestly, a bunch of this is done by the processor inside the TV itself, so I wouldn't touch it too much because if you're a purist, then you will not like the kind of changes that are happening. But if you keep all of these settings to low, I noticed that it actually does a decent job of enhancing the image. Now, talking about the motion performance, especially for when you're watching sports or if you're playing certain games that have a lot of action or speed and movement, then the TV does a fairly decent job. I'd say it's not the best, because sometimes I did notice some judder and ghosting in certain scenes. Now, talking about gaming, using a PS5 with this TV is a joy, because of course you do get support for 4K 120Hz with a legitimate HDMI 2.1 cable, by the way, so that is a non-negotiable. But along with that, you get support for VRR, you get support for ALLM, and more importantly, the TV itself has auto HDR tuning, which ensures that the picture looks really good. And I sunk in like a couple of hours into Death Stranding 2, and I must say, boy, it was a lot of fun to play the game on this large TV. It looks good. It looks very premium, for the lack of a better word. By the way, one interesting thing that I noticed is that if you go into the picture settings when you're playing a game, you do get the game mode, but even within the game mode, there are specific settings for FPS and RTS as well. And with FPS, we notice that the quality does take a toss because I think it's, prioritizing response time over quality of the image itself. But again, this is specific to consoles. Like, I think you should get similar level of performance even if you have an Xbox. However, like I mentioned at the start, if you're a PC gamer and if you want like 165 Hz, that's not going to be possible with this TV. Alright, sound time. And with this specific size of the TV, the basically 65-inch TV, you get a 40-watt 4-speaker sound system, and it sounds fine for the most part. The mids are good and the dialogue enhancer works fairly well, but the bass is very lacking, if you ask me. There are certain TVs that I find sound better, and I would suggest that even if you buy this one, and Sony has a good penchant for good audio, I would still suggest that you buy a soundbar with it for a better experience. And if you end up picking a Sony soundbar system like the HT-A7000, then you can actually use the TV as the center channel with the acoustic center sync option that's available, which I feel is kind of cool and sort of builds on the ecosystem features. But this works only with Sony soundbars, mind you. That's all about the TV. But again, coming back to the price, the 1,35,000 price with discounts right now feels like a very sensible price for a Sony TV, right? And a Sony mini LED TV, no less. This is probably the most value for money Sony TV that you can buy in the market right now. It's not perfect, obviously. I wish the brightness was better, the sound quality was slightly better, all the HDMI ports, if they had HDMI 2.1, that would have been great too. Having said that, it gets some of the basics right. For example, the Dolby Vision tuning is great. The upscaling experience should be fantastic. So if you're somebody who's still using cable TV, you're gonna love this TV. And now coming to that but that I mentioned at the start, and that is the competition. And I've been comparing it to the competition throughout the video, and that is the Samsung QN90F. In fact, the QN80F is also a good option, but the QN90F and the Sony Bravia 5 are in touching distance of each other in terms of price. I actually called it Reliance Digital, and they mentioned that the QN90F is about 6,000, more expensive than the Bravia option. But for that extra price, you do get far more value. It gets much brighter, like I mentioned. It has more dimming zones as well, so the contrast ratio is superior. All the 4 ports are HDMI 2.1 ports, along with one port offering you 165 Hz for gaming as well. So if you're paying 150,000 rupees, you get far more value from the Samsung TV. So yeah, now that I've laid it out for you, which one would you pick? Would you pick the Samsung QN90F or the Sony Bravia 5 now? I know that Sony is also good and you can save some money, but the ball's in your court now. All right, that's it from me for this TV review. I don't know, for some odd reason, I just love doing TV reviews, and I could be making mistakes, and if I am, I apologize for that. And you do please give your thoughts and comments, your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep tracking and stay safe.